Another really important thing that GCMs need to include is the effect of aerosols. Now, we've been talking about human pollution with things like carbon dioxide and methane, both of which are invisible. But there is a much more visible form of human pollution, and this is tiny particles and chemicals like nitrous oxide and sulfur sulfates in the atmosphere. I'm going to call these collectively aerosols, and you can see them. Here's a picture of Shanghai showing the sort of cloud of aerosol pollution over it. And this is bad in all sorts of ways, but also really affects the global climate. They can be produced by pollution, like here. They can be produced by bushfires. This is a satellite picture of southeastern Australia in January 2020, when there were bushfires raging across much of the southeast. Here's Canberra, and you can see the fires all the way around, generating huge clouds of smoke that eventually settled over Canberra and gave it some of the world's worst pollution for a while. Now, these aerosols are deadly. They kill huge numbers of people. It's hard to estimate. You don't normally say this person died because of air pollution, but what you do see is that rates of cancer and lung disease and asthma deaths all go up dramatically. Most estimates suggest that between 5 and 10 million people every year are killed by this aerosol pollution. So globally, 1 in 5 deaths is caused by air pollution. So this is far worse than COVID, far worse than the people killed by global warming. It's absolutely lethal. It's currently worst in India. 10 or 15 years ago, China was the worst, but they've cleaned up somewhat, though it's still fairly bad in China. But India is now currently the worst. And there is a huge literature showing all the bad effects this air pollution has. It kills people, but also gives people who stay alive some bad health. For example, there's plenty of evidence that pollution makes people do worse at school. If China had US levels of pollution, children would do 26% better in verbal tests. In California, the US, they tried putting air purifiers in the schools, and they found a dramatic improvement in student performance. It's equivalent to like making the class size 30% smaller, the same sort of improvement. This air pollution is associated with mental illness, premature births, crime, suicide, and violent behaviour. So it's a really bad problem, and it's worth fixing for its own sake. But it also factors into climate change. A natural experiment comes from ocean liners. Ocean liners burn a particularly noxious form of oil because it's cheap, and in areas where there are huge numbers of ocean liners going backwards and forwards, like the North Atlantic, the total effect of these is quite enormous. And this huge amount of pollution in the air hanging over the North Atlantic actually reflects away a lot of sunlight. Early on, people were unclear, is it going to make the Earth hotter or cooler? But the models clearly have shown that, in fact, this aerosol pollution tends to make the world cooler. So it blocks the light coming in more than it blocks the heat going out. It has complicated effects of multiple feedbacks, but nonetheless it's a net cooling effect. And since in 2017 a lot of the most polluting ocean ships were changed, for example, that's led to a big rise in the temperature of the North Atlantic. Another case where this is seen very clearly is volcanic eruptions. Eruption like Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991 produced huge clouds of dust pumped into the stratosphere that went all the way around the Earth, and that actually dropped global temperatures by about 0.4 degrees for about a year. Larger eruptions further back in history, like Krakatoa, have caused bigger effects. Some of them would cause huge famines and therefore revolutions by disrupting crops and farm yields all around the world. So there's abundant evidence that if you get a lot of these tiny particles, whether it's caused by volcanoes or bushfires or pollution or ships, into the atmosphere, it cools the world down. This is a worry for a long time because of the idea of a nuclear winter. Now, atom bombs themselves don't create this sort of pollution, but the idea would be if there was a major nuclear war, you're going to get the different countries dropping atomic bombs on each other's cities, and cities burn. So if you get the Russians dropping bombs on New York and San Francisco, and the United States dropping bombs on Moscow and St. Petersburg, and these cities burn, as they burn they might generate huge clouds of ash that might get carried up to the stratosphere and drift around the world. So the idea would be, if you had a major nuclear war with large numbers of cities destroyed and burning, you might think, if you don't live in a city, if you live in a countryside, sure, there'll be some radioactive fallout, but if you can shelter for a couple of weeks, you're over the worst of that. But it could be much worse than that, because there's a huge amount of smoke carried up into the atmosphere, carries around the world, and could cool it down. And in fact, we saw that small changes in temperature could trigger ice ages. This could be enough of a change to trigger an ice age. Current feeling is that probably there won't be that much smoke from the cities, and the smoke will usually be rained out fairly soon, so it's a little controversial how bad this would be, but I really don't want to try it.